Okay, so welcome back everyone from the coffee break. I hope you enjoyed it. So we have a few more presentations coming up from LINX staff giving some updates on current work that we are carrying out. So next up is Dan Smith, who's our cybersecurity policy manager. He'll be talking about our risk review registration. So he'll talk a little bit about our insights into our risk review registration and our current activities there. So Dan, wherever you are, there you are. Welcome up.
Thanks, Narani. Good morning, everybody. So, yeah, I'm Daniel Smith, Cybersecurity Governance and Risk Manager at LINX. So, as the title suggests, one of my responsibilities is risk management. So, going to give you an overview of how we approach risk at LINX. Starting then with, well, what are we actually talking about when we talk about risk? I think if you look up what is the meaning of risk, what is a risk, you'll find probably about 500 different definitions of what it is. But I think for us, in terms of how we approach it within our organization, we can say a few things. First of all, obviously, it's something that's uncertain that may occur in the future. Obviously, if it's happening right now, if it's already happened, it's no longer a risk. It's an issue, or it's an incident, or it's something that we need to be dealing with. Second, I think we're very much talking, we're a business, we're talking about particularly business risk. So it's something that may prevent or delay our objectives or cause us harm in some way, prevent us from being able to do what we want to be able to do. It's obviously something that we can only estimate, so we can't say for certain how likely it is to occur or what the consequences would be, but we have to reach some kind of judgment call about both of those things. And then finally, obviously, not all risk is necessarily bad. In our day-to-day lives, we all take some level of risk, otherwise we would never leave the house. And it's the same within an organization, right? So if we never decided to take any level of risk, then we would essentially stagnate. We wouldn't be able to, undertake any innovation or progress the businesses in any way. So it's really about assessing what our appetite for risk is, what level of risk we're comfortable with, and having all the information necessary to be able to determine that, which brings us to risk management. So this really is a framework that we use in order to be able to understand what risks we face as an organization. And once we understand what those are, we can then make an informed decision about what we want to do about it, if anything, and then be able to hopefully implement some kind of strategy to reduce the harm that they're able to do us. So very much not about trying to eliminate all risks, which would be basically impossible to do anyway, but even if you decided to try, the amount of time and resources that you'd spend would not be proportionate probably in any way. So instead, it's really about gaining a better understanding of the nature, the scale, and potential effects, and being able to take appropriate action to mitigate those. So it's really about making sure that we're as informed as possible about what's going on. So why is that important? Well, for several different reasons, but obviously, first of all, we've got a series of critical assets, of resources that we want to protect. So we want to avoid bad things happening to those if we possibly can. So we want to understand the damage that could be done and try and stop that happening if we can. Second of all, business continuity. So that's another of sort of my responsibilities at LINX, but obviously, if the worst does happen and some sort of incident occurs, if we're better informed about the risk, the impact, then we're going to be in a much better position than we would otherwise. So, when suddenly a global pandemic happens, you're in a better place than you would be if you had done no thinking about what the potential consequences of that would be. Strategic decision-making, so again, it's being able to assess and judge the risks versus the rewards, so it enables you to be able to take better decisions, make more informed decisions, which obviously is important as a business. Also leads to enhanced stakeholder confidence, so fairly self-evidently, for members, for government, for regulators. Obviously, you're going to have more confidence in an organization that is thinking about this kind of stuff than you are in one that's not. Compliance and legal requirements. So this is an area that we're seeing increasingly in terms of action from both government and regulators. So as an IXP, we're regulated under the Network and Information Systems Regulations, NIS, as an operator of essential service. And as part of that, that puts obligations on us to undertake appropriate risk management, to be able to demonstrate to Ofcom as the regulator that we are taking that seriously. And so we often have to have various questionnaires that we have to prove that we are taking risk management seriously and informing them what we're doing about it. And then finally, improving our resource allocation. So obviously, you want to be directing your resources towards your most serious threats. So being able to understand what those are obviously allows you to do that much better than just sort of throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks. So I think it's sort of summed up in a quote from James Lamb, but he says the only alternative to risk management is crisis management, and crisis management is much more expensive, time-consuming, and embarrassing. So very much something that we're trying to avoid at all possible if we can. So how do we approach that then? So this is sort of broadly the cycle that we go through when we're considering risk, the sort of the framework that we've adopted at LINX. So the first thing we do is we need to have some kind of strategy in place as to how we want to approach this. Otherwise, essentially, we're just going to have a sort of house of cards that's going to collapse at the first hurdle. So that's the first thing we sort of need to determine. Once we've got that in place and we've sort of decided on our methodology and what we want to do, we need to start identifying and assessing all the risks that could occur. We will then want to challenge and evaluate the controls that we have in place to mitigate those risks. And if we decide that those controls are not adequate or that we actually need to be doing more, obviously we've got to take some form of action. And then finally, we obviously want to monitor those as they progress, report on them, and essentially have confidence as an organization that we're managing those appropriately. So start off then with our strategy. So we sort of started out on this journey a number of years ago now, but started off really with the responsibilities in terms of who is responsible for what in this area. So there's me at the top there, the cybersecurity governance and risk manager. So very much I handle the day-to-day management and the responsibility of organizing the sort of the process and managing that sits with me. Then above, you've got obviously the senior management team as the senior members of the business who are responsible for setting our risk appetite, for being comfortable with the level of risk that we're taking and the strategies that we're adopting in order to mitigate those. And then you've got above those, you've got the board who are obviously responsible for providing oversight, for being, again, happy with the direction that we're taking. So we have not only the full board who consider annually the company risks, but we also have a dedicated finance, risk and security board subcommittee who take a day-to-day interest in that stuff as well. And then you've got the asset owners and the risk owners, so I'll talk a little bit more about those later, but essentially they're the people who have the day-to-day expertise and knowledge to be able to assess what kind of risks are facing their assets, and being able to manage the treatment strategies and controls for those. And then finally, you've got a role, obviously, for all staff. What you want people to be able to do is to be able to identify risks, to be able to report them, and to be able to ultimately make sure that they're handled appropriately. So having that sort of awareness and knowledge amongst all staff is also quite important in the whole process. So once we've established those responsibilities, obviously we've got to have some kind of way of gathering all this data. So as I'm sure everyone's aware of, risk register is used to capture that sort of data. So you'll see risk registers pop up in all sorts of different areas. And you might have project risk registers, specific department risk registers. We're of a size where we can have a sort of company-wide risk register. And essentially that provides us with the means of describing, scoring, and ranking our risks. So we can use it to identify ownership, what controls we currently have, and ultimately the need to do further reduction or put additional controls in place. Quite important to say, I think, that obviously what we're not trying to do with our risk register is to record every single risk that our company is facing. I think that would leave us probably with thousands of different risks, and essentially we'd lose everything in the noise. So really what we're interested in is the most significant threats that are facing us, facing our critical assets, and being able to record the action plans and mitigate those to acceptable levels. So we essentially need the most important risks to be recorded and managed on the risk register. So how do we do that? How do we go about that process of working out which is important and what doesn't necessarily need to be on there? Well, we used what we call an asset-based assessment for our risk register. So an asset in our sort of terminology here is basically anything we want to protect. Could be a person, could be a system, could be a building, could be a piece of hardware, could be a piece of software. Basically anything that could be harmed and we want to make sure is not. So the way we approached this when we were starting out is to, first of all, identify a series of what we call our top-level assets. So these were very much what we thought were the core building blocks on which our business relies to function. So we identified 11 of them, and they're essentially the categories that we then group our risks around. So they're the core things that we want to protect. I'll go through what exactly they are on the next slide. But for each of those top-level assets, we then identified the critical assets that underpin those. So for each of those top-level assets to be functioning, we sort of asked ourselves the question, well, what else needs to be functioning in order for those to work? And that gives us a list of our critical assets and allows us to identify any critical dependencies that those may rely on. So what are those top-level assets? So first of all, as you would probably expect, is the availability of our exchange platform. So we want to make sure that that is available and working. Second of all is our sort of competitive viability. So our ability to remain financially stable, to be competitive in the marketplace. Financial control, so our ability to be able to make payments to people, to be able to bring money into the business, is obviously a fairly important part. Being able to comply with our legal and regulatory obligations. So not only, obviously, legislation from government, but also contractual obligations that we may enter into. So being able to make sure that we are compliant with all of that. Our reputation and ensuring that there is external confidence in us from people, not only from our members, but also from government, from our partners, is quite an important part. The welfare of our staff, obviously, so the health and safety of our staff and their general welfare is important to maintain. Likewise, we want to have the skills necessary to run the business, so make sure that we have the appropriate level of skills amongst our staff. Business support operations, so anything that information systems, for example, that helps us to support the functioning of the business. The public affairs mission, so obviously not only representing members on public affairs, but also our own internal public affairs in relation to the regulation that we're under. Governance of the company, so effective governance of the company. And then finally, obviously quite a specific one for us, but obviously the ensuring the viability and health of the mutual model is also very important to us. So that's the final thing that we want to make sure that we're protecting. So the next thing we did, after identifying those sort of top-level assets and the critical assets that underpin those, is we then undertook what we called a sort of asset resilience analysis. So the idea behind this was we'd identified these critical assets, and we knew that we could then identify some specific risks that were facing those. But what we wanted assurance on is, what if something unexpected happens to those assets? So if something that we haven't been able to think of were to happen, how resilient are each of those assets? And can we have confidence that they'd be able to withstand unexpected risks? So to do that, we asked sort of 5 questions in relation to each of these. First of all, do we know what we want it to do? Do we know how to deliver it? Can we deliver it? Can we protect it? And can we recover it? And we sort of gave each of those a sort of a yes or no answer to get a score out of sort of 5. So score of 5 would be 5 yeses. And that basically then gave us some degree of confidence that the assets would be able to be resilient. And then any risks that we then identified would sort of be the permitted exceptions to those. Obviously, if we encountered a situation where we were answering a lot of no's to those questions, that sort of then directs us to go away and perhaps improve the resilience of each of those assets. So that brings us to sort of step 2 in the cycle, where we know what our sort of core assets are. We then want to start identifying and assessing the risks that are affecting those. And we do this by using a fairly standard threats and vulnerabilities model. So for each of our critical assets, we identify the threats facing it and any associated vulnerabilities. So the idea there being that a vulnerability would be some kind of weakness or gap in our protection efforts, and a threat would be the potential for some kind of threat agent to be able to exploit that vulnerability. So the idea being that if you don't have a vulnerability, then there's nothing for the threat to exploit, so it wouldn't be able to materialize. And obviously, if you don't have a threat, then there's no real issue or anything to be able to exploit the vulnerability. So very much the risk then becomes the potential for loss when that threat occurs. So that essentially then gives us our, with those threats and vulnerabilities, the risks to each of our critical assets. So now we know what the risks are. We obviously we want to identify anything that we have that could mitigate the impact of that risk occurring or the likelihood of it materializing. But in order, before we listed any asset as mitigation, we wanted to make sure that it was also subject to the asset resilience analysis that I covered earlier, so we could identify if it was, for instance, particularly vulnerable or if there are any critical dependencies. The idea there being, obviously, it's not very useful to have something in mitigation if that is liable to fall over at the drop of a hat. So we wanted, again, some assurance that the mitigation that we're listing there is actually going to stand up to scrutiny. So then, once we've sort of identified our risks, obviously, as you would expect, we've got to somehow score those. So we want to score them in sort of 2 areas. First of all, we want to know what the maximum impact of a failure would be. So we give that a score from 1 to 5. And like we do exactly the same for the likelihood of that threat occurring. So again, a score from 1 to 5. 1 being, obviously, it would be very negligible impact or unlikely to occur, through to a 5 being catastrophic or almost certain to occur. And we ask risk owners to score those on the basis, obviously, that they're the people who should understand that the best. They're sort of the subject matter experts. So we ask them to provide an inherent score, which is before you consider any mitigation in place, and then a residual score, which is after you've considered mitigation. And then essentially, those 2 impact and likelihood scores are used to calculate the risk score. Now, where we encounter some kind of difficulty is you sit down with a risk owner and you say, well, can you score this 1 to 5? And they say, well, OK, you're telling me that a 5 is catastrophic, but what does that mean in terms of the exchange platform, and how does that differ to financial controls or public affairs? So we wanted to try and make sure that we have as detailed guidance as possible. So for each of those 11 top-level assets, we can say, well, for the exchange platform, a 1 impact is basically going to look something like this. Something that's probably going to be handled fairly easily by BAU, through to a 5, which is going to be, some kind of, critical prolonged failure affecting the viability of the organization. So that helps us to really ensure consistency in the scoring and gives more information to the risk owners to be able to score those appropriately. So that then it leads us to our risk scoring matrix. So it essentially kicks out a score from 1 to 25. Now, you'll probably notice that that doesn't directly multiply. The reason for that being is that when we started looking at this, a straight multiplication means that you end up with a risk that may have a likelihood of 5 and an impact of 1, obviously scoring a 5, the same as a risk with an impact of 5 and a likelihood of 1. Now, obviously, if a risk could be potentially catastrophic, even if it's incredibly unlikely to happen, we don't really want that to be considered right down and coming out as a 5. We probably want that to have some kind of scrutiny, even if it's just to assess that the likelihood is as low as we think it is. So that's why we use this sort of weighted risk scoring matrix, and we weight that score more in favor of impact to make sure that those sort of higher impact risks receive scrutiny both from the sort of senior management team and the board to sort of give us confidence that we're managing those appropriately. So once we've identified and we've made an assessment of our risks, we obviously want to look at what kind of controls that we have in place. So to do that, we give each risk a status, and there are about, again, probably tens of different statuses that you see sometimes that can be used for risks. We use 3, which we find works quite well. So we say either a risk is controlled, which means that we are, broadly confident that the controls we have in place to mitigate and manage that risk are adequate or fit for purpose. We can have a status of accepted. So we may not have controls in place, but essentially we've evaluated it, and we believe that it's either outside our control, so there's nothing really we could do to mitigate it, or to actually put in place further controls would be impractical or too expensive in relation to the actual risk itself. So in that sense, we're just going to accept the risk. And then finally, sort of the most important one is needs mitigation. So this is where we either don't have controls in place, or we don't believe the controls we have in place are adequate. And essentially, we take the decision that further steps need to be taken in order to mitigate it. So that's very much where we then need to have some kind of strategy to be able to address that. Now, considering when we're assessing whether a risk is controlled or not, we obviously, again, only take account of any mitigations that have been subject to our asset resilience analysis for the reasons I described earlier, to give us assurance that that is actually controlled. And again, obviously, if you can't identify any mitigating assets, then you can't say that it's controlled. It's either got to be accepted or needs mitigation. So then we need to sort of take some kind of action in terms of our risk treatment strategies. So again, we have sort of 3 categories here, depending on what kind of score it falls into in terms of the level of assessment that it has. So anything that sort of comes out below 8, we say it's not necessary to treat risks with a score below 8, so they'll just be monitored by the relevant risk owner and reassessed annually. So it's not like we're necessarily ignoring them, but the impact is determined to be low enough that they can be essentially monitored to see if they increase, but otherwise we're not too worried about those. Anything that scores at 8 or above, which is really, I guess, where we're setting our risk appetite, has to be reviewed by the senior management team. So we go through an annual exercise, which I'll talk about in a minute, but essentially where any risk that sort of reaches that threshold is assessed. The senior management team, heads of department, will decide whether those controls are sufficient to be able to control the risk. And then obviously, if new controls are required, they're sort of then responsible for coordinating that to make sure they're put in place. And then for our higher level risks, so that's anything with a score of 12 or above, is reviewed and discussed at the board level. So any sort of strategies for treating those would be discussed and approved by the board. So again, giving a level of oversight to make sure that the board are happy with the treatment strategies that we're using. In terms of what those strategies actually look like, I mean, obviously that can vary a lot depending on the type of risk. So for instance, you might have a risk of power failure, and the treatment strategy is fairly straightforward. You might have dual power feeds. We then get into a slightly more sort of nebulous category of risks, when we have things like pandemic, which we had on our risk register. But that was one of those things where we assessed as not necessarily requiring, a great deal of action at the moment. Instead, we assessed our capability to be able to, for instance, shift people to a largely working from home pattern, and determined that, were it to occur, essentially what we would do is write a more detailed plan and strategy for addressing that when it happened. And so when, we did have the sort of COVID pandemic, we actually found that we were able to implement that fairly effectively, and helped us to sort of mitigate the impact and adapt to that probably in a way that was much smoother than it would have been had we not considered that as a risk. Finally then, final step of our sort of cycle, monitor and report. So I sort of touched on this already, but we go through an annual exercise where we update and review the entire risk register. So that's a process that's coordinated by me. I'll sit down with each of the risk owners and we'll review the risks allocated to them. We'll remove any that are obsolete. We'll add any that have emerged. That then goes through a review by the senior management team to review those, to identify any additional risks, and essentially to ensure that we've got consistency of reporting and scoring. And then that goes through to the board. So we have an annual report presented to the board, which summarises the outcome of that risk review process, and essentially it is signed off by the board. Now, obviously, risks don't just occur annually, so there's obviously also got to be a process in place where you can fast track those onto the risk register as they occur. So we have a process in place to be able to do that as well. Obviously, there are all sorts of ways that could happen. It could be some kind of serious incident, a complaint, a risk assessment, or any sort of other ad hoc report or review. But essentially, we want to make sure that we're able to record and review those risks as they occur, rather than just having to rely on that sort of annual process. So final slide then, really just to look at some of the sort of overall risk landscape and some of the sort of major categories of risk that could impact us. So a lot of these are actually quite closely related. They're not necessarily things that we may be able to do anything about now, but could have an impact in various ways further down the line. So first of all, obviously, geopolitical risks. Notably, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we personally reviewed a lot of our risks related to cyber attacks, particularly from Russian threat actors. So, events like that can increase the likelihood of things like that occurring. Threats to the global supply chain. So again, I think that's something that probably affects everybody. But again, obviously, ties into the geopolitical point above. You're looking at China and Taiwan, for example, could have an impact. Looking at the Middle East, threats to global shipping, all that kind of stuff could have an impact, obviously, on the supply chain. Energy supply. So I think this time last year, I gave a presentation around how we're approaching the potential for sort of an electricity supply crisis. So I think that risk has sort of reduced a little bit in the last year to what we saw, for example, in the winter of 2023. But obviously, that's still a fairly current threat. New laws and regulations. So again, I think I've touched on this already, but we're seeing increased interest from governments around the world, I think, really, in terms of mandating certain actions, particularly around security, cybersecurity and risk management. I think that's become very apparent through the Publication Telecom Security Act, for example. So much more interventionist approach around things like that, data security, etc. And then finally, obviously, as we expand overseas, places like Nairobi, you're entering new markets, you've got new legal systems, you've got new regulations to contend with, so that can throw up its own sort of set of risks and challenges as well around that. So with that, that's all from me. Thank you very much. Is there any questions?
Yes, a question over there. Thank you so much, Dan.
The risk scoring algorithm that you're using that precedes the matrix, is that shareable? Because obviously the numbers on the matrix didn't make an awful lot of sense if we don't know what you would consider a 5 versus a 1.
So in terms of
what rules you've applied to decide whether it's a 3 or a 4 or...
Okay, so we have so the determination of whether it's a 3 or a 4 is. So are you talking about the overall score or the sort of the impact or likelihood score? Because
The impact likelihood, the 1 to 5 in.
yeah, so those are determined by the risk owner. So we present them with guidance, fairly detailed guidance about.
Is that guidance shareable?
I'm looking at Curtis. Yeah, I don't see why it wouldn't be. Yeah, happy to.
Good question. Any other questions? Please go ahead.
Good morning. Thanks for the presentation. In terms of confirming the risk or the mitigation you've put in place for the risk, are you running cut tests or similar exercise regularly?
So we absolutely review. So what we do when we have sort of mitigation plans is we'll have a strategy and a plan that will be presented and approved. That will then obviously be monitored, progress. And one of the things we do as part of this sort of annual risk review is to report on the progress that we've made in sort of remediating the previous year's risks. So we absolutely would sort of follow that through from start to finish, as it were, to make sure that those are being properly mitigated, rather than someone comes up with a plan, it's left on a shelf to gather dust, and no one does anything. So yeah, very much part of that monitoring and reporting is around assessing whether those are working effectively.
Okay, so but back on the cut test, is there any plan or has it been discussed to have cut tests to prove the resiliency of the platform in general?
Well, so keep in mind that the risk register is way broader than just the platform, right? It contains all business operations we ever do. A cut test, I don't know how we would define that. I mean, we do tests, we do a lot of lab analysis. I mean, would we do a live test on the platform? I think that's a little bit more discussable, but if we would take that risk. But we do a lot of testing. I think Richard or some of engineering can probably talk more about the testing we do about the actual platform. But keep in mind that is that's one specific aspect of the business impact. I mean, this covers a much wider range than just that, right? I was going to say that one thing that Dan didn't say so much about is that what we also do is desktop exercises every year, or sometimes more than a year, where Dan will play through most of the time the senior management team and if needed some other staff, depending on the topic, where we will be given a exercise to deal with, and we have done more than desktop. We have done some with the entire company involved, or large parts of the company. We have simulated everything from terrorist attacks to power crisis to a lot of things. So we have done a lot of simulation exercises. And while they are not necessarily designed directly out of the business impact or the business criticality, of course, they touch upon a lot of these things. And afterwards, we do an after review, and a lot of this goes as feedback into what Dan does, or the asset owners will have to take this with them and learn from how you do this, right? So I think one of the things that's important to note is that this is not a static document. It changes. I don't know how much of it changes every year, but it's clearly updated. And there's a lot of the assets get updated every year, and we also learn through real incidents on the platform, etc. If something happens that affects this, we do update and we do build on that. So I just want to add that it's not just a theoretical exercise. It's very much something we test and live with and work on throughout the year. But for the actual live cutover test, I think someone for engineering would have to explain more in detail how we do that and the testing we do around it.
Thank you. Any other questions? We do have time, so if anyone has. I'm going to throw in a question for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Because I know the work you do is very comprehensive, and even for me, this is a very interesting presentation. But I think for an organization who's starting this work and starting a risk registry, and who might want to start in a simple way, do you have any pieces of advice where to start? But also, I know there's a lot of good resources out there. Are there any resources that you would recommend?
So in terms of where to start, and I think this is something that we have sort of developed and built on, but I think it comes down to sort of determining a strategy. So determining what sort of methodology that you're able to implement, and there are I mean, there are lots out there. I mean, there's an entire ISO standard dedicated to risk management, but really being able to start there, and I think getting then, once you've sort of determined that, getting your sort of senior management support and buy-in for that process is sort of vital. And then I think even if you just then have an Excel spreadsheet and you've got a list of your assets, you can start identifying risks against those. So I don't think you need to have anything particularly complex in place, but again, it's really being able to have a clear idea of what you're trying to achieve and what your methodology is, rather than sort of the temptation, to just sort of sit in a room and try and come up with, anything bad that could happen. In terms of resources, and there's lots of things out there. There's lots of consultants. I think who will charge you a lot of money, but I think you can probably find again various free resources which will provide you with sort of basic models to follow. Certainly, we found when we were doing this process to start with, is that seeing what other people have done is a good starting point. Certainly what we found, and I'm sure other people would find, if you then want to sort of tailor that to how you specifically work as an organization. So don't necessarily just take things off the shelf and think they'll directly apply to the way that you do things. But certainly they can provide a really useful starting point, and much easier than just starting with a blank sheet of paper when it comes to stuff like this.
Yeah, great, thank you. Last chance, no questions? No? Well,
Okay.
good discussion. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Dan.